Hello there,
Oh, hey.
Chris Anderson. Yeah, come on, get on it.
Hello, this is Chris Anderson in London.
Calling Chris Anderson in London. Now I'm behind you.
He is, and calling Rick Byer in Chicago.
In Chicago, and you are just back. Like I can still see the burrs of Scotland upon
you can hear the haggis coming out of my mind.
And the Scottish pipes are playing.
They were.
Scotland.
I was in Scotland to see the mighty Rangers. We are the people. Crush Hearts at Ibrox Stadium. It was super fantastic. So
it's good. It's great.
Saw some friends of mine and my bus driver on the Scotland trip, and we went to the Ibrox, and it was magic. And then lots of pubs and fish and chips, and good.
Awesome. Well, welcome back, and welcome everyone to History Happy Hour. And a special thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. And check out their rich offering of military history tours at not at historyhappyhour.com, at StephenAmbroseTours.com.
Don't tell them that yet.
I don't know if you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH podcast. But however you find your History Happy Hour, we are glad you are here. And today we are going to welcome back our five-time guest,
the legend,
five-time guest, Joe Balkoski. And we're 29th Division historian. We're really, really excited that Joe's going to be here. So let us know who's here. Let us know you're there. Tell us what you're drinking. And Chris, tell me some of the people who are with us.
Well, Frank is joining us from sunny southeastern Mass. Ken's joining us from Kansas. Brian Sabo from Pennsylvania with an appropriate 29th Division patch, picture by his name there.
Ooh, anybody else?
Yeah, Donna from Alabama. And Ballard Brian from, with an Aperol Spritz, not from an Aperol Spritz, I hope. And Brian Peacock is with us, and Brian's an old 29er, so it's good to see him back.
Oh, fantastic.
Susan, so yeah.
Oh, excellent. Well, I want to thank all of you guys for joining us. And of course, we want to thank everyone who supports us on Patreon, especially our top shelf patrons. Did mail out a couple of hats this week to Marcus and to, oh my God, every time I do this, I forget who the other hat went to, but sent them out. It'll occur to me eventually. And
are we going to tell people what we're going to do with all of our money?
Oh, we're going to buy a team, right? We're going to buy one of the teams in like the 7th league
of what sport? Football. See, so there'll be Wrexham. So when you're done watching Wrexham on HBO, there'll be the History Happy Hour team.
The History Happy Hour team. We're going to design special tops, and okay, fine. Now we are really getting into a wasteland here, Chris, where I really don't want to go.
All right.
So give me a cue and let's get out of this wasteland and into the show.
All right. The bar is open.
The bar is open. You have to tell me what's on tap, and you have to cue me when do I play the very special animation that I have.
Okay. Well, what's on tap this week is, again, you've already alluded to this. We are really excited to have a fantastic historian, great author, good friend of the show, Joe Balkoski, and he's going to come back to join us to continue the discussions that we've been having following the 29th Division, all the way from Omaha Beach across Europe. So the next installment of that story is Joe's book, Our Tortured Souls, the 29th Infantry Division and the Rhineland from November to December 1944. And I think it's a really fantastic and important book because it talks about a part of the fighting in the ETO that really gets overlooked far too much. And Joe just nails it as always. But before we do that, as I said, he's one of our favorites. He's an old friend, and he's the first time five-time appearance historian.
You are
Joey. He's very impressed. Yeah.
And do you have? We have to have a ceremonial
all right,
wearing of the hats.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, God.
There we go. How's that?
So you're
See?
seeing it here,
Very
folks.
honored to have this.
First time ever. Joe's the first guest with
Get a
a
hat.
hat. It's probably the first time Chris Anderson has worn this hat.
It is actually
Maybe
the
first or
Yeah.
second time, but we are all here. Now you can remove your hat. Did you guys get
Okay,
all the
thanks.
pictures you want? Pictures,
Yeah,
take them. Okay, fantastic. Remove your hats.
All right.
And oh my gosh, we'll get on with the show. Joe, you got something to drink there with you today?
I have my 29 Let's Go, very cherished 29th Infantry Division 29 Let's Go mug. Nothing special in it, but it's the mug that's special.
It's the mug that makes it special.
How about you, Chris? Are you in recovery mode? So you're just drinking water?
Oh no, I've got the last of the Glen Turret.
I got some McCallum's 12 in honor of your trip there. So we're happy to do that. I'll let you take it away with the questioning of the interrogation of our first 5-time guest. I'm just very excited about it.
I know you are. You've been working on that all week.
Yeah. So I can play it again anytime.
This is going to step back a bit, but I think it would be helpful since we are following the 29ers from the beach all the way to the end. Without sounding too corny, Joe, where did we leave these guys off? I mean, I know we were in Brest. They started to fight east. So where are they at before we get to what we're talking about tonight?
Well, the 29th Division, along with many other divisions, moved into the Western Germany, near the Limburg area of Holland, which is that appendix that sticks down in the Netherlands. And we left the division in early November 1944 in a relatively stagnant position. They'd held this position about a month and a half in conditions that were very difficult, that we'll talk about in this show. But the book, Our Tortured Souls, opens on November 16th with what was supposed to have been the ultimate offensive that was going to bring Nazi Germany to its knees and win the war. Didn't work. We'll talk about that.
Bring the boys home by Christmas. Yeah.
So I'm sure that many of the people in our audience are very familiar with the story of the 29th, but can you recap very briefly? They begin on the morning of June 6th. On D-Day, and they've had a pretty rough war up to this point. Can you kind of give us a little sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, they were in from day one in the European theater. They landed on the western half of Omaha Beach on D-Day, fought through Normandy for 9 weeks. Thought they'd get a break. Instead, they moved into Brittany to seize the very significant harbor of Brest. That took another 2,600 casualties and almost a month. Moved by truck and cattle car in 500 miles into Holland and then subsequently into Western Germany and fought a very depressing kind of delaying, diversionary action throughout the month of October that gained nothing and again lost couple of thousand men for no real purpose, waiting for the moment at which my book opens in November. That was going to be the concerted effort by 3 U.S. armies, the 3rd under Patton down in Lorraine, which opened its attack on November 8th, 1st Army, which, as you know, pushed into the Hurtgen Forest with difficult results there, and then the 9th Army, in which the 29th Division was a part, supposed to push to the Rhine by Christmas. And so the division, Rick, as you had said, had a very tough war. I mean, it was in the thick of it from day one, and they had already lost more men in the European theater than any division in action.
16,000 casualties.
Yeah, but it ultimately would end up being 23,000. But they, as we'll learn, the division was very fortuitously spared the Battle of the Bulge.
Well, I mean, just to give people a sense of that, a division at full strength is how many men?
14,000 men.
So they've already lost over 100% by the time they've gotten to this point.
They've lost over 100%, but much more to the point, the people at the tip of the spear, so to speak, the infantry platoons and the rifle companies, they probably turned over 3 times. The rear area units had very little turnover, But the
Yeah.
infantry, the people in rifle squads, there wasn't anybody left by November virtually who had landed on D-Day. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, when we've started to talk about this, but Joe, maybe you can kind of get into this a little bit more. Before this offensive, which is supposed to be the war-winning offensive, when I was reading the book, the one word that kind of stuck with me as I'm reading about the lead up to this is exhaustion. I mean, what state is this division in as it's about to go into this attack?
It was in a very badly beaten up state. And part of, look at the title of my book, Our Tortured Souls. It's not a happy time. And some things happen in the next 6 weeks that definitely reveal that, when you're not winning, morale goes down the tubes. And certainly in this phase, the American army and, all allied armies on the front were simply not doing what they had hoped to do. And there were a couple of things that were very forceful, had very forceful impact on the morale of the division that were new to the division. One was the weather. This is the first time the 29th Division and all the Allied divisions on the Western Front were experiencing a late fall European weather. I mean, it wasn't anything unusual about it, but it was soggy, it was wet, there was no sun. The other thing that was very different for the 29th in particular was the terrain. This division, if you had watched the earlier shows that you guys had done with me on the division, had fought mostly in hedgerow country, the bocage country, both in Normandy and in Brittany. And that, is very claustrophobic fighting terrain where you don't really see the enemy further away than 50 yards. And then abruptly they enter Western Germany, and all of a sudden the battlefield looks like a pool table for miles and miles, in which you can be, you could be shot by a German machine gun at a range of over a mile. No place to hide, no high ground. I mean, all the 29th Division veterans who I talked to when I interviewed them about this phase of the war said, forget everything about hills or any such thing as high ground. There was none. It was like a pool table and, a duck walking on a pond waiting to be shot. And that terrain change was a shocker. And the third quick thing, and then I'll stop. The third thing is they had entered enemy country. And I don't think they had taken into account what was going to happen when the German army strictly adhered to Hitler's suicidal directive to not give up an inch of ground of the fatherland. It was taken literally. And every single village, insignificant village of no particular military importance, was defended almost to the last man. And the resistance that the German troops, and supposedly not even very high quality German troops, the so-called Grenadiers, which, the American army at first derided as second-rate troops, they changed their opinion about that very quickly. As Eisenhower famously said, when somebody interviewed him and said, well, what's going on? We're not moving, with any speed, and we're not, approaching the Rhine as we had hoped. He said, well, the one thing that we didn't take into account is how ferociously the Germans were going to fight. And, the expectation was that they were ready to give. In the race across France, early September, in the highest reaches of the Allied command, British, American, the expectation was that they were ready to give up. Look at what Montgomery expected with Operation Market Garden. It didn't come true. And that was the first writing on the wall. And Eisenhower said so much in a press conference. He said, we didn't think they would fight with this level of intensity. And this whole book is about that. So.
Yeah. So November 16th, and they're all lined up They have their zone. I have a map here from your book, and the 29th Division is starting out on the left, which would be the west, and they are headed for the Ruhr River, which is the line on the right, just before the German town of Jülich, which is on the other side of the river. And they have all of 6 miles, I think, to go to get to the Ruhr River. And this turns into a bloody slog on day one. So, how does it go so wrong so quickly?
So many reasons. As I said, the weather was a killer. The American Army was just getting used to the use of air power in effective ways, but the persistent cloud cover in late fall in Europe is such that you're not really going to get much tactical air support. And in fact, the November 16th jump-off date for the offensive that I discuss in my book actually was supposed to have happened a week before, but kept getting postponed day by day by day, and because the airplanes couldn't fly. Very typical problem all across the Western Front, until finally, at the highest reaches of the Allied command, Bradley said, "We go, planes or no planes." I also discuss, I don't like to make opinions in my books. I like to give you the readers the facts, and I like them to draw their own conclusions. But there is no doubt about it that one of the reasons why the 6 miles that the 29th Division had to advance did not go well were tactical mistakes, misjudgments, to a level where, honestly, the division commander, General Gerhardt, who we'll probably talk about, was about to be relieved. In fact, he really was relieved, but Eisenhower saved his career and would not relieve him, even though Gerhardt's army commander, General Simpson, said, "We need to get rid of him." As a microcosm, the opening day of the attack, the 29th Division had 9 infantry battalions, and each one of them about 800 men strong. And just very curiously, nobody really understands why, General Gerhardt only threw 2 of the 9 infantry battalions into the offensive and left 7 behind the lines. Big, big mistake in retrospect. Of course, it's very easy to be a Monday morning quarterback, but certainly didn't work. He didn't use tank support in the opening 2 days of the attack. Nobody really knows why. Possibly it was because the terrain was so muddy that he didn't think the tanks could operate. But interestingly enough, there was an armored division to his left that was using tanks. This failure in the first 2 days of the attack had absolute tragic consequences. Men were asked to move across these open beet fields. They were basically sugar beet fields with very low vegetation, moldering, decaying vegetation, because it was November. And it wasn't like a cornfield where a man could hide in. It was, 8-inch high beet plants. And when the men were walking across open fields of as much as maybe 1,500 yards in width, with heavy equipment, and in the face of Germans very heavily entrenched in all those towns that you saw on the map that you just displayed, Rick, they were like, in fact, if you look at that map, the first target of the November 16th attack was the town called Seersdorf that you can see in the left part of the center of that map. The opening 2 days of the attack was basically a massacre. Men advancing across that open field between Baysweiler and Seersdorf were just cut down by German machine guns, not only from Seersdorf, but up north in that little village called Setterich, which we're ultimately going to see if you're going to show the film that we talked about a little earlier. The men couldn't move. They had to lie in these beet fields with no protection, and they couldn't advance. They couldn't go back. Their only salvation was to wait for darkness, which is what they did. and it was a World War I style attack that made about as much progress as you might expect from having read about the Somme or Verdun. It was the American version of that, except it was the next war. Anyway, it was one of the examples of how the American Army had not yet matured enough to figure out how to solve the problem of making set piece offensives that were really, really tactically proficient. Now, if you're very generous enough and can get me back for a 6th visit in my last book of the series, I will give you a hint that the division and all other divisions on the Western Front did solve these problems.
Oh no, Joe, you're not getting out of this. We're keeping you for you're stuck for the long haul. So yes, we'll have.
Okay, well then, in my last book,
next time.
Okay. Anyway, so that's it in a nutshell, Rick.
Sure.
It was tactically not good. The terrain was not good. The weather was not good. You couldn't get air cover, and
no tanks. Yeah,
and no tanks.
Well, but okay, so. And I know you don't want to give an opinion, but we want to put you on the spot and make you give us an opinion. You quote a battalion commander talking about the start of this attack, and he blames it on the failure on screwy tactics, he says. And I mean, shouldn't they have expected more of the 29th at that point? I mean, is the failure things that they didn't foresee, or is there something else going on? Is it the command? Is it the conditions? Is it, because they're obviously they're experienced at this point.
I would say that it was that if you have to boil it down into a nutshell, it was the theme of our last History Happy Hour talk.
Oh, okay. Yep. Okay.
The division commander, as well as every division commander on the Western Front, overconfident that the German army was beaten. They were not as good as we were. We just need to push them, and they're going to crack, and it's going to be like the end of the Great War, when finally the Germans did crack in early November of 1918, and we really expected that scenario to play out again. It really was a question of let's talk about the 29th Division specifically. General Gerhardt, the division commander, really felt that the offensive was going to reach. There he is in his famous Jeep, the Vixen Tor, which again I'll point out I took care of in the museum that I ran for years. I took care of that Jeep for almost 3 decades, so I'm very fond of that Jeep. General Gerhardt believed that he was going to race to the Rohr River in a matter of 2 days, jump over the Rohr, and be on the Rhine at General Bradley's directive within a month. And he really believed that opening day of the attack was simply going to be the beginning of a leapfrogging operation in which every battalion was going to seize a village, and then a fresh one was going to jump over to the next village, and then another fresh one would move on. And that he thought it was going to be a game of checkers. But it turned out that the Germans were not only well entrenched, as you might expect in these villages, they'd had months to do so, but surprisingly, their commitment to fight in this losing proposition was very high. And, again, if we can look at some films later on of the Americans capturing Germans, you'll be surprised. The Germans are not young men. They don't look like they're very good soldiers. But the American army learned that they were very committed to adhering to Hitler's directive to fight to the last, to defend every inch of the fatherland. And whether they did so willingly or unwillingly, I don't know, but they did.
But they did.
Yes, it did. And of course, they were very, very well armed. In a tactical sense, they were better armed than we were. They had better automatic weapons. Their army at this point had almost given every soldier, essentially a version of what now, an AK-47. I mean, the predecessor to the AK-47 was the Sturmgeschütz 44, which was a marvelous invention for its time, and the Germans were heavily armed with that weapon. and we were still using the old Browning machine guns, BARs, and the M1 rifle. We really had a little bit of a disadvantage there. So,
well, we've mentioned this film footage a couple of times, so I think we should take a look at it. And this was shot by a Signal Corps cameraman named Donald Calamar. It starts, I think, about 3 days into the offensive. I think you're going to see a slate that has his name and has the date on it at the start of this footage. So we get to see the 29th and the territory they're in. You talk about this footage in the book. I know you're very familiar with it. So it's about 4 minutes here. Tell us a little bit about what we're seeing or the story behind it.
okay, this is actually the third day of the offensive when things started to get a little better for the division. It's when General Gerhardt realized that it was not going to be a leapfrogging operation of any simplicity. He decided that he'd better commit much of his division. And this film depicts the attack of the 1st Battalion of the 116th Infantry on the village of Setterich, which is up in the northern flank of the offensive. And it was the one that I had mentioned that was cutting down the Americans in the open fields at very long range. So the village had to be taken. Here are the tanks of the 747th Tank Battalion, the first time in the offensive that they were actually put into use. And there is the battalion commander of that 1st of the 116th, named Tom Dallas. He's on the left with his radio operator, although it is said he didn't need a radio operator. There he is. That's a great picture of him. It is said he didn't need a radio operator because his voice was so booming that he could give orders over a mile distance simply by yelling. You know, this footage is actually not really recognized very often, but it's very rare in that it is actual combat footage. If you look very closely, you can see the puffs of white smoke coming out of the machine guns on the bow turrets of the tanks, and you can see occasionally American soldiers flopping to the ground taking cover, and there you can see them shooting over those open fields. You can see soldiers behind the tanks. And soon you're going to see German prisoners with their hands up running toward the camera. There you see them. This was really the first successful attack of the offensive, but it was also a precursor. They're German prisoners coming in now. It was a hint that getting to Ulick and the Roer River was not going to be a matter of days because every village was going to have to face an attack like this. Also note the bleak, sky, note the waterlogged, there'll be some footage where you can see the waterlogged trenches. That's a good shot.
Well,
so this is the unit. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
This unit landed in the very first waves of Omaha Beach on D-Day. But as I said, probably of the 800 men in the battalion, I'd venture that maybe 15 were D-Day veterans of the 800. So, and another thing, the cameraman of this footage was not a member of the 29th Division, but he had gained a Silver Star 2 days before by dropping his camera, running into the open fields on the opening day of the attack and rescuing several wounded 29ers in the beet fields. He became a legend in the division. There's his name on the thing.
Donald Calamar.
He gained a Silver Star, even though he was a very rare occurrence for Gerhardt to give a Silver Star to somebody who was not in the 29th Division. So here are some prisoners. I'm not sure you can see it clearly enough.
Well, they don't look too aged. They don't look too young. They
that fella. Yeah, well, it was said that the Volksgrenadiers were either too young or too old. So I mean, I'm not an expert on the sociological makeup of those divisions, but they clearly were not first-class soldiers and were drawn in to the army only after the Allied race across France to form these divisions.
Well, we'll come out of that now. I think we can we can come back to
Yeah.
ourselves. And Chris, we'll go
Yeah,
back.
well,
But that gives people a good idea of kind of what this looked like in the early days of that attack.
So you
Yeah.
say that, you say that by the third week of November, so pretty soon into the attack, the division faces a crisis unlike any it had experienced before. So is the crisis specifically that the attack is breaking down, or their tactics aren't working, or what is the crisis that they haven't faced before, and how do they start to work through this?
That's a great question. It's a crisis on many levels. As I mentioned earlier, when you don't have success, morale starts to deteriorate. And certainly every one of these attacks on inconsequential German villages that triggered dozens and dozens of casualties to no appreciable purpose other than moving another 800 yards toward the Ruhr River was beginning to have a very negative impact on the morale of the soldiers. Secondly, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a second. Secondly, the weather. As I said, the 29th Division had not experienced fighting in the open in this kind of weather since they'd been in Europe. Even worse was the fact that from the directive of the commanding general, General Gerhardt, it was part of the so-called division Bible that no unit of the 29th Division could ever set up a headquarters, be it a company headquarters or a regimental headquarters. No headquarters could ever be set up inside a house.
Yeah.
It had to be outdoors or in a tent. That was a rule. And they opened this offensive with that rule, and it was just kind of catastrophic. And the result was one of the greatest crises that the division ever faced that had absolutely nothing to do with the enemy. You've all heard of the term trench foot. It's mostly a World War I term you hear, but the 29th Division suffered grievous losses from trench foot. For every roughly 2 or 3 physical casualties they were having in battle, there was a man that fell out of the line due to trench foot.
Yeah.
And trench foot, it's a very, very simple thing. It doesn't have anything to do with freezing temperatures. You can be outside even in temperatures in the lower 50s. But if your shoes and socks are immersed in water for a matter of hours, 8-10 hours, and even if it's 50 degrees, you're going to suffer serious foot problems. And if it went on for days, as it did, because nobody understood or nobody had prepared for this, these men were absolutely debilitated. They'd take off their socks and their feet were black. They had no feeling in them. If it was left untreated, they couldn't walk. And, ironically, it was actually considered a better deal to get trench foot than to keep on fighting in these attacks across the open fields. So a lot of men almost welcomed trench foot.
Well, I was going to say, and I don't want to throw you off track here, but I mean, very often trench foot is an indication of a much bigger problem, right? In the morale of the unit and the condition of the unit, right?
That's a totally great point, Chris. It was had the division been winning, you would not have had this problem. It's surgeons at all the levels of the army said trench foot was very addressable. All you had to do was have a couple of pairs of dry socks and get the men out of the foxholes for a couple of hours, and you would have been good. And the senior surgeon general of the army in the European theater, he confessed that the army was absolutely unprepared for this. He said the army footgear is absolutely lousy. To think that we were going to go through a fall and a winter in Europe with the shoes that we expected these soldiers to use, it was unforgivable. Yeah. But you're right. The bottom line was that when you saw your buddies dropping like flies, making attacks across open fields against an unseen enemy with machine guns, it was very easy to fall to trench foot and say, I'll be able to go back and get 5 days out of the line. Yeah. And that was, it was a morale problem. That was the first time that the division had been hit with a morale problem in since D-Day. I mean, a serious morale problem.
Yeah.
Well, the story of the 29th is a bloody one, starting from D-Day, liberation of Brest, and into Eastern France. But I do definitely feel like the tone shifted here, whether it's you or whether it's the men in the unit, that there's increasing bitterness about the staggering losses. People are coming into command companies, they're being killed hours later. Bitterness among the soldiers, maybe bitterness in you as a writer. Gebhardt at one point uses the phrase German enthusiasm to describe the German counterattacks, and then you keep using the word enthusiasm throughout the rest of the book, and I could feel, maybe I'm wrong, but I could feel the rebuke there in your phraseology.
Yeah, I think so, because
I mean, I know we're not supposed to get into opinions, but maybe you were showing some enthusiasm for an opinion there.
Well, I want to tell you that it was painful to write this book, and because I saw cases in this month or month and a half period that I write about in Our Tortured Souls that were unprecedented in the history of the division. I saw men who had gained silver stars in Normandy in this November period receiving orders to attack from their superior officers and saying, I won't do it. I'm just not going to do it. It happened several times. You had company commanders who received an order to attack across an open field to seize another village after just having done it 2 days before and having lost 25 guys, and then getting the same order to take another village that all it was another 800 yards closer to Jülich. And they went into this commander's conference and said, I'm not doing it. And that's a morale problem because, they had to do it because they got rid of them if they said I couldn't do it. And it happened many times. Another thing that was unprecedented, first time in the history of the division, you start to see men going AWOL. You almost never in Normandy or Brittany ever saw an AWOL problem. Well, one exception, when the trains went through Paris on the way to Normandy, there was an AWOL problem. Generally, that was solved, and the men somehow made it back to the division. They didn't really want to go AWOL, but they wanted to enjoy Paris. But this was a real AWOL problem. And then even one or two, you read about this in World War I a lot, and in some cases in World War II, self-inflicted wounds.
Yeah.
You very rare occurrence, but you see a couple of morning reports with people being removed from the front with a self-inflicted wound. And that is the first time you ever see that in the 29th Division. But don't get me wrong. I want to tell you one thing. Yes, I had a little bit of maybe rebuke in me in the style that I wrote the book, given the tactics that were practiced. But when you look at the performance of 99% of the men who were asked to do these things, they did them with unquestioning duty, as fatal as it turned out to be. They did them. Yeah. And it's just unbelievable to me how they could endure. And 99% of them did endure if they were lucky enough not to be hit by a bullet. And that to me was, one of the most impressive things. In the book, I talk about some of the great chaplains in the division, and one chaplain in particular, a Baltimore native, Eugene Patrick O'Grady, who really, he just took the souls of the men into his heart. And in fact, that is the origin of the title of the book. Somebody referred to Eugene Patrick O'Grady as the man who soothed our tortured souls. Okay. And of course, I hate to say this, but O'Grady himself became a victim. And on, I think it was November 25th, he was bringing coffee and donuts up to the front line, and he got hit by a mortar fragment and was killed. And I mean, talk about a morale problem. He was the most beloved man in the 29th Division. And when they held a funeral for him in Baltimore in 1948, when they brought his body back, that was that. And that's how the book partly ends. One soldier who was a mere private, who had been taken care of by O'Grady, he said something like, "I look forward to the day when Chaplain O'Grady will assemble his men in heaven for one last, one last embrace of his regiment." And anyway, it was, in the end, how the men endured is part of the theme of the book.
Yeah. So I'm gonna sneak in two questions. One is from Charlie Burry, because he's asked this question a couple times, and I wanted your answer on it. So Charlie wants to know, what is the average percentage of replacement in the rifle companies versus combat veterans by this time?
Well, it varied by company, of course, but if you want an average rule, I'd probably say 90 to 95% of the men in the, well, I'll be more specific, in the rifle platoons.
Yeah.
Because companies had men like cooks and clerks and things like that. A rifle platoon had men, just fighting men. I would say in a rifle platoon, 90 to 95% of them were replacements. In many cases, 100%.
Yeah.
And I mean, it is said in my next book that when some of the 29th Division units received the very prestigious Presidential Unit Citation, which enabled them to wear a special bar on their uniforms, General Gerhardt said he wanted the streamer to be attached to the company guidon by a D-Day veteran. And he assembled all of the companies, and it turned out that most of the companies couldn't find a D-Day veteran. And that was, that's a famous story in the division.
Yeah. All right. So we've dealt with some pretty heavy things here, and we've dealt with the state of the morale, faulty tactics, conditions they don't expect, etc. But obviously, they do start to turn it around. And so let's start going in that direction. And I'll just call out one village, and I'll probably mispronounce it. I'm sorry, but you say outside the village of Durboslar, Durbuslar. The division fundamentally changed how it fought a battle. So how did they fundamentally change how they're fighting their battles, and how does that impact their progress?
Several ways. They learned to be much, much more effective about artillery support. They really were very good about using smoke. They had not really effectively used smoke to obscure the view of Germans defending these villages. And in preparation for attacks, artillery battalions, one of which was attached to every regiment, would absolutely lay a smoke barrage on that village that would cause it to be enveloped in a fog that didn't dissipate if the wind was not too bad for an hour. And, by the time that dissipated, the Americans were in the village. Secondly, the use of tanks. The 747th Tank Battalion, which nominally was not a part of the 29th Division, was very, very effective in allowing the men to cross the open fields with some cover, providing covering fire as the tanks moved over the open ground. The other thing was, leadership. The company commanders, who, as Rick pointed out, oftentimes had just taken command days before because they were replacing somebody who had been killed, were learning the techniques could be improved upon. They were learning to envelop the villages and come at them from behind. But nevertheless, Chris, Durbuslar represented, a watershed in this campaign, but the next two villages, Borheim, which is down near Jülich in the right, and above it, Oslar, those two villages should be known. The names of those two villages should be household names to anybody who studies this phase of World War II in the Rhineland, because those two battles were among some of the most vicious, protracted, costly battles that any division fought in the Western Front in World War II. And I often tell people this, the Hurtgen Forest, maybe you guys have done a show on the Hurtgen Forest. I don't know if you have, but the Hurtgen Forest is today recognized as the epitome of the frustrating, costly, pointless fighting that didn't get anywhere in the fall of 1944. Everything we're talking about today was worse than the Hurtgen Forest, but never got any attention in the American press or by historians later on.
Why do you think that is?
One of the reasons for that is the Army group to which the 29th Division was attached was actually a British Army group. But the 29th Division was actually answering to Montgomery. And the American Army was actually a part of Montgomery's 21st Army Group. So consequently, I think a lot of American media types didn't think it was cool to be attached to an army that was actually working under British command. Now that might be going out on a limb, but I don't.
Well, we talked about, we had a guest on just a couple of weeks ago talking about General Simpson, who was the commander of the 9th Army. So that was above the Corps commander, above General Gerhard, but below General Montgomery. And he was not a particularly PR-oriented guy. He was a kind of a nose to the grindstone, get it done, don't seek out a lot of attention kind of guy. And that might have been a reason as well. I wanted to just ask, though, about Kozlar. It is actually a story that appears in the papers in the U.S. I was looking at a New York Times article about it this morning from that week in 1944. You get two companies that are either cut off or surrounded, but Gerhard doesn't even want to admit the use of the word surrounded. So can you talk a little bit about that action and also about his attempts and, why he did this? I don't know, but why he didn't want anyone to even use the word surrounded, crossing it out of the official reports.
Well, can I piggyback on that question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd say, why wasn't Gerhard relieved? Okay.
Yeah, so that was my next question.
Oh, sorry.
Put them all together. Go for it, Joe.
General Gerhard, I mean, again, I've mentioned this to you in the past. I have very mixed feelings about him. He was a person that, without question, brought a very special morale to the 29th Division. You very, very rarely met guys after World War II that had such a pride in their division as 29th Division veterans had. But his eccentricities were, they were numerous. And among them, I've talked about in the past the chin strap rule. You could have a $5 one if you didn't have your helmet chin strap hooked, which was absolutely hilarious to members of other divisions when they heard of that. But among his foibles was the fact that he didn't allow terms to be spoken over radio or telephone communication that represented any kind of negativity. And among the negativity was the word surrounded. Germans could be surrounded, but no 29th Division unit could ever be, quote unquote, surrounded. It was not allowed to be spoken. You could not say that the Germans counterattacked. As you said, Rick, you could only refer to the Germans were enthusiastic last night. Wow. And people lived with this nonsense, and it was almost part of the what made the division distinct. But as to Chris's question, in early December, when the division had still not pushed up to the Rohr River and was still suffering tremendous casualties in the fights at Hassenfeld Gut and the Sportsplatz and Borheim and Kozlar, General McLean, who was the Corps commander, General Gerhard's immediate superior, had enough. And he looked at the statistics of all the divisions in his command, and he noticed that the 29th Division always had more casualties on a day-by-day basis, but had accomplished nothing in particular better than any of the other divisions in his corps. And I have the transcript of this. He called up General Simpson, who you just mentioned, Rick, and he said, I have to get rid of Charlie and Charlie Gerhardt. And Simpson said, why? And he said, because I'm seeing casualties that are inordinate. They're intense, and something is going wrong. I mean, at this rate, there's going to be no division left. And Simpson said, okay, if you think that has to be done, we'll do it. And Simpson took that up the chain of command and said, we recommend that General Gerhardt be relieved. And, you know, there was also a couple of black marks against General Gerhardt already. You know, he'd run a house of prostitution in Brittany that General Bradley noticed, and Bradley got very, very upset with that, even though that house of prostitution thing was grossly exaggerated. But also, General Gerhardt had disappeared for 10 days when supposedly there was a furlough, and there was no furlough. Anyway, he already was in the doghouse, so his relief looked like a natural. But it got to Eisenhower. Eisenhower shared 1 year on the West Point football team with Gerhardt. Gerhardt was the star quarterback on the West Point football team. Eisenhower dropped from the team and became a cheerleader at West Point football games. So I don't know whether that was played into it, but, you know, Eisenhower said, we can't get rid of this.
Don't mean a thing if you got that ring.
It was pretty unusual for him not, I mean, because the U.S. Army was pretty brutal in relieving division commanders for far less. So that all right. So
can I just piggyback also? But you said earlier in the show, you said that for a brief while he actually was relieved. Tell me what you meant by that.
I meant, but that McLean and Simpson had sent the correspondence saying we're
relieving him.
Yes, and then Eisenhower simply said no. And again, I want to say that there's no question that Gerhardt was a fighting general. He may have done these things that caused casualties, but generally he accomplished what he was supposed to do. And, you know, that was considered a positive trait. You know, military leadership in World War II at this level was very tricky because all of these leaders had been majors only 4 or 5 years in the past, and to lead 14,000 men in the biggest cataclysm in world history, very difficult. And so you had to be, you couldn't be too choosy. You had to take men who were willing to take this stress, and let's face it, they had to be willing to in their psyches understand that men were going to get killed by the thousands and live with it. And he was one of those, and many generals, of course, had that trait. But can I say one thing? I know we're running out of time.
No.
One thing I wanted to say, since in my books, I always like to talk about, you know, not only the sharp end with the privates and the lieutenants, you know, and the field grade officers leading their men into battle, the majors and the lieutenant colonels. But I also like to talk about the perspective of the 4-star generals and even the president. And in my book, I also talk about Churchill and the decisions that Churchill and FDR were making. And I wanted to say that if you want to look to the real reason why this book is called Our Tortured Souls, you have to go all the way up to the highest reaches of the Allied leadership, and that is FDR, Churchill, Marshall. You got to remember that George Marshall was running a global war. He was the chief of staff of the U.S. Army, and he detected, and this is very, very sparsely discussed in history books these days, that after the liberation of France and the Low Countries, that Americans began to assume that the war was over. Yeah. And he noticed that in the early fall of 1944, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were leaving war-related work because they thought their jobs were done. 30% of the Kaiser shipyard work staff had left by September or October of 1944. Marshall realized that, as he famously quoted in alluding to the 18th century conflict known as the 7 Years' War, he famously said, America as a democracy cannot indulge in a quote-unquote 7 Years' War. A king can do that, but in a democracy, the people have to have happiness. And these people, in America, you can't keep them at these war jobs and sacrificing for very long periods of time. So consequently, he gave orders to Eisenhower, you've got to try to end this war in Europe by January 1st, and you got to give it everything you can. And when that filtered down through Eisenhower to Bradley and Monty and McLean and Simpson, down to Gerhardt, in a nutshell, this is what happened in November of 1944. And it's also, coupled with the fact that Hitler had a much greater power over his people than we thought. When you combine that rush to end it with Hitler's recalcitrance, it wasn't pretty. So I want to leave it at that. If that makes sense.
That does make sense, Joe. And I want to hit you with something completely out of left field, and I don't want to change the tenor of this. But related to 29th Division, we had a good friend of the show, Brian. He's a former 29er and a career MP. So I was going to try to slip this in at some point, and it really wasn't your name. But he just wanted to know, being a 29 MP, career 29 MP, is there enough information available to do a book on the 29th MP company?
Well, number one, it was not a company. In World War II, U.S. Army divisions only had MP platoons.
Okay.
So they were very, very small detachment of MPs. Now, in the modern U.S. Army, divisions have MP companies. But no, in World War II, they thought that MP administration was mostly going to be done at Corps and Army level. So, not really an answer to his question. There are after action reports by the platoon, but it really was a very small bunch of people.
Okay.
I mean, you could write about simply what you read in those reports, but not much in there. It was only about 60 guys.
That's the answer to the question.
Well,
okay.
we've taken it from General Marshall down to the MP platoon in the last 60 seconds of the show, and that seems like a great place to leave it. We have been talking, in case there's anybody in our audience who doesn't realize it, with Joe Balkoski, who is the author of the book Our Tortured Souls, the 29th Infantry Division in the Rhineland, November to December 1944. It's a truly excellent book, part of a series of 5 books about the 29th Division. They're all worth reading. I hope we win the war. That's still to be seen after we go through one more book. Joe, thank you so much for taking time to be. We'll play that animation one more time, to be our first 5-time geek.
Well, please have me back for the last book. The last.
No, we're going to.
No, that's it. No, 5's the max. No, we're leaving.
It's a much happier book. I promise you, much happier.
We will bring you back, and
but you're going to keep writing books, so we're going to have to keep having you back. So I don't know, you get like a fleece to go with your hat.
We started with a hat, folks, because we don't want to get to when we have a 10-time guest, and then who knows what we're going to do there. So that's what your Patreon dollars go to support.
You'll get it.
Thanks so much, Joe.
Thanks, Joe.
All right.
29, let's go. Fair enough. Right. Well, Chris, we've been on World War II for a few weeks, but we're getting off of it next week.
Are we?
And we're going to bring back, I think it's only his 2nd time on the show, but bring back Jack Kelly. And he's returning with a new book, God Save Benedict Arnold.
Indeed.
The true story of America's most hated man.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. So we'll have some interesting conversations.
Hero, traitor. I put that there for you.
I know you did. I know
you. Because otherwise it would just be hero, traitor. That's just the way it is. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.